In this video, I will talk a little bit about different forms of feedback, and we will talk about a method of giving feedback and kind of the rationale behind those steps in the feedback process. They will be linked to some of the prior material recorded in the two previous videos, so I encourage you to make sure you look at those before you look at this particular video. So one kind of, I think, important differentiation to make is that there's at least two general types of feedback. One is what we might think of as reinforcing feedback, maybe thought also of as positive feedback. And this is acknowledgement. It's sort of recognition of things that people are doing well and that you'd like to see more of. So you're kind of reinforcing behaviors that are present and that you want to see continue. Another kind of feedback can be called redirection, and that might be also considered critical feedback in the sense that this is where there's a behavior we don't want to see or we want to see less of, and so the purpose of our feedback is to either get some feedback to stop some behaviors to stop or some behaviors to start that are absent or we would like to see more of. So in the reinforcement, I think that sometimes because this doesn't feel as threatening to us, we may not put as much intentionality into our planning of giving reinforcing feedback. And so sometimes that just might mean it ends up being something kind of like, great job today, keep it up, right? And that's kind of the attaboy, the slap on the back, like good work, keep going, just, plow on, move forward. The trouble with this feedback is it's not actionable, right? So just in the way that, whether we think it's positive or negative, any kind of feedback to be actionable must identify specific behaviors in specific situations and the impact they're having. So those are kind of the three components of good feedback, whether it's reinforcing positive feedback or kind of critical redirecting feedback. So, instead say something like, when I heard you speak up about that example of intrinsic motivation, how you framed that and your example illustrated that point to me in a way I hadn't previously understood it. Thanks for doing that. It really helped me, right? So that's the idea of more concrete, a specific instance, a specific setting, and kind of how it helped you. It unlocked this new way of thinking. So if we think about, reinforcing or positive feedback, again, we want to describe the behavior, and then we want to explain what impact it had and for whom, whether it's you as the feedback giver or if you knew that the behavior that your employee had a big impact on another employee or on a customer, explain who it is. And it helps the person take responsibility for the success, right? They can own that and understand that it was recognized. And by doing this kind of reinforcing feedback, it is a type of reward. So if we think about motivation, praise and recognition is reward. And especially if we think about also in the sense of drive, when we think about now that rewards. So it's not that we tell somebody, do this good work for your colleagues and then I will recognize you. That's an if-then reward, and it's more of an extrinsic reward trying to drive motivation by striving to get that recognition. In contrast, it's more like catch people doing good things and then acknowledge it. And so it's a now that reward, and that reinforces the fact that they were motivated to kind of conduct that work no matter what. So if we think about the components of good feedback when it's reinforcing feedback, again, actionable feedback should be direct. It should be about the person that you're talking to. Having a little technical difficulty with my videos here today. I'm going to move myself over here so you can see better. So if we think about actionable feedback, right, whether it's reinforcing positive feedback or it's critical redirecting feedback, we always want to be direct. We want to talk to the person and about the person who we're trying to give the feedback to. Obviously, it's more powerful than telling somebody to tell somebody else that you notice their good work if you do it yourself. Again, identify specific behavior. What did they do that created this sort of positive regard that you have for them? Again, share the impact. When you gathered that information that I needed, at the last minute that I asked for it yesterday, I was more prepared for my meeting, the tenure meeting that I was conducting, and I was able to come up with a point that redirected the conversation in a really effective way. And without you doing that for me, and particularly doing that, on a short timeline yesterday, I wouldn't have been as successful in my meeting. Thank you. Right. So this is kind of telling again the specific context, the specific behaviors, not just a general thanks for helping out yesterday, right? But again, don't describe the other person. Don't say you're great. That effort you put in yesterday, compiling those citations for me at the end of the day before you left, made all the difference to me today to be able to be effective making my presentation, right? That's what we're looking for. So the kind of sad thing is that even though giving positive feedback should feel good and not be that difficult, we actually don't see very much of it done in organizations. It's a pretty cheap way to reinforce behaviors, and somehow we still don't do very much of this, which should tell us something about why performance reviews and performance feedback and redirection is uncommon and often rather ineffective. So what I'd say is now for the hard stuff. So, this is just a funny little cartoon. You could pause your video if you want to watch it, but, what it might feel like to get critical feedback, right? To be basically told that you have created something that looks like it was made by drunken toddlers, right? So hopefully we're never going to go quite that far. I think that our humor is effective when it's scathing. But the reality is that's what it sounds like to us sometimes. So when someone's giving us critical feedback, they may have good intentions, but as we've already discussed in the previous one of the previous videos, that receivers have their own set of issues in terms of the emotions that get kicked up, in terms of their kind of own higher view of themselves, these kind of favorable biases we have that make it hard for us to receive feedback. So there's sort of a ganging up on us all to try to give constructive, critical, redirecting feedback. I'm not sure how they're going to react, and I think that's one of the biggest problems with people trying to give this kind of, particularly if someone gets angry or starts denying what you're trying to tell them as feedback. So, this idea of there's side effects, and those kind of unpleasant experiences often are reasons why we don't engage in reinforcing feedback, right? We get the sense that people don't appreciate it. We get the sense that people don't agree with us often. And then sometimes, there's just a really negative reaction. So an important way to think about, improving this is to think about the feedback process itself, and to understand that this process, if we follow a certain number of steps where we've embedded in the idea of actionable feedback, we've understood the inference ladder. We think about the kinds of places where information processing biases come into play, we can actually be much more effective at delivering constructive reinforcing feedback and kind of this redirecting critical feedback. So if we look at this kind of process, right, we want to think through what we're trying to accomplish here. And I think an important thing to kind of note right away is that delivering the feedback is already quite a bit down the way in the process here. And before we even think about delivering feedback, we want to formulate the feedback, and we want to think about what is our purpose. And in a previous video I mentioned, sometimes it just feels like people want to get even, or they want to just, kind of put somebody in their place. And if that's your goal, then it shouldn't really come as any surprise if people give a negative reaction and if they don't actually improve their performance. I think people are pretty good at detecting when there's not kind of a a kind of a true interest focused on them in the process. So the first point is, really just get your reasons right for why you're doing this. And if it's going to be critical feedback, what do you really want to accomplish here? Are you genuinely wanting to change behavior in a positive direction? If so, then that's going to be a vital part of thinking through the whole formulation of the feedback. As you're formulating the feedback, it's also really important to think about, what are your fears? Are you afraid that they might cry? Are you afraid that they might get angry with you? Are you afraid it's not going to do any good? So what's the point? It's worthwhile just taking a moment to reflect on that and think through what are your concerns with this. And then, to link to our actionable feedback, identifying concrete behaviors in specific situations and the impact, who's having the impact on whom, on what, is vital in the formulation process. So once you've, checked your reasons, you've gone through making sure this is going to be actionable feedback, the other really, really important thing is to practice. Whether that's just standing in front of a mirror, or whether that's finding your partner, a good friend, a mentor to say, I have to give this difficult feedback. Could I run it by you? Could I practice what I think I'm going to say and see how you think or how you think the reactions could come, right? Oftentimes we don't invest that sort of energy or time into the feedback giving process. And, here it's also worthwhile just to give a little bit of time to think about what might happen and how will I react, right? Because I think I've had those instances where I've given feedback and someone reacted very differently than I expected, or I didn't really think about how the fact that they might, get very aggressive in their response to me, and I become kind of like a deer in the headlights then, and I don't know what to do. So it's important to think about what you might do if somebody reacts one way or the other. And then finally, we deliver the feedback. And what's kind of also an important thing here is to check the understanding, to ask some questions to see if you believe the person heard what you were trying to deliver. And one thing here is that sometimes if someone does get quite emotional, it might be worth saying, I think, we could both cool off a little bit here. Could we have a meeting later today? Or could we talk about this again tomorrow after you've had time to kind of digest and think about what I said? So if you can check in and see that the person has heard it, then you can kind of get at, what's happening. Can they help you understand why they've been behaving a certain way or why something hasn't been happening? Because then you can get into the final stage here, which is coaching. And an important part of coaching is that we're not trying to just tell people how to fix their behavior. Again, if you think about motivation theory, thinking about intrinsic motivation, thinking about autonomy, about purpose, about mastery, people tend to have a higher sense of motivation when they have some control over identifying solutions. So your inquiry can be finding ways to indicate your support and help. If they want to bounce ideas for problems solving off of you, to be there ready to do that. But try to refrain from just telling them how to behave in the future or telling them how exactly they should fix the problem. It should be sort of a mutual coaching to get the maximum motivational benefit. Just to reinforce this, really good feedback takes planning. It just doesn't happen. I think the very worst thing is kind of what I call the hallway ambush, right? You just happen to accidentally run into somebody in the hallway coming out of the bathroom and you say, oh my gosh, I've been meaning to talk to you. And then you just lay it on them. Number one, they're not in a good place there. Number two, it could be public. It could be humiliating. There's a lot of reasons not to do that to somebody. But you need to think through how you're going to handle it and be prepared for that. Organize your thoughts so you can do the very best on this. And then, keep thinking about why you want to do this, right? Are you looking at just regular methodological kind of approach to checking in with people so that you keep things moving in a positive way? Are you trying to correct poor performance? What should you be thinking through could be the cause of this, so that the person doesn't feel necessarily just personally attacked, so that they're more likely to hear and receive the feedback. Don't get me wrong, there might be some real personal individual thing a person's doing that they need to stop. or start. But if it comes across as a personal attack, you're not going to get through to them. So you need to kind of come at this, not the sandwich, not trying to say something nice and then the hard thing and something nice. That can be confusing too. But again, being very concrete and specific about what's going on, but also open to the possibility that something's going on that's not in their control, that you can help problem solve to fix to correct that performance. So as you're planning, I think these are some questions to ask yourself, right? Can I actually identify the specific behavior? And if it's sort of a vague sense of being upset with somebody, then that's a good clue that you're not really ready to go engage in giving feedback. Do you have the data? Do you kind of have the evidence in place so that there's, you kind of want to lower the deniability if you're really ready to try to do corrective feedback. Ultimately, do you have positive intent? Are you doing this because you want truly to help somebody improve? Or again, are you just looking to try to, punish somebody because you're frustrated? You have to think through what will be the indicators that someone's open to hear from you, and what situations might increase the possibility that they're open to hear from you. Linking back to the first video, part of this is that it's important to start developing a general culture that this is expected and that this is common, so that it's not threatening. Because if you rarely ever hear critical feedback until something really seriously is wrong, then of course you're gonna have a stress and emotional reaction when someone comes to tell you that they're going to give you some kind of feedback or criticism. So, if we think about the core content, we're looking for behaviors where we want to make sure that we as the feedback giver have actually feel confident that we have sampled correctly and that this is not just an anomaly, that it's some sort of true indicator of behavior that we need to correct or redirect. We need to make sure that we discuss the impact it's having on ourselves, on the work group, on the clients, on whomever, but that we have identified that link and that it's demonstratable, so a person can't just bat you off with it. And then, of course, on whom that is happening. So we've heard this already with the actionable feedback, but these are some good things to ask yourself to make sure that your kind of selection of data and your inference process is actually accurate. So there's a little example down here. So a behavior is somebody's a half an hour late for their very first shift. And so that's the behavior. And if you have data and evidence that they really didn't arrive till 30 minutes late, then you can tell them that that was what you're trying to correct. And the impact is, right, other people had to stay late, or somebody had to stay longer than their shift ended and they didn't get home to their family on time, right? These are kind of the connections to make, linking specific behavior to specific impact. This is kind of classic. This is the general broad brush. You never listen. You're always late, right? Those are things that people will immediately be able to discount. You've already lost any chance at this point to really get a change in behavior if you make this sort of really blanket, abstract statement. So here, in this case, instead of "you never listened to me," your evidence is that somebody presented data that was different than what you told them. And that you're taking that as an indication that they didn't listen to your input. And here's what happened. Right now they think we're a problem, or now they don't trust us as much. So here's the impact that had. And that'll give an opportunity to open up a dialogue. Then if there was a misunderstanding, if the person misheard you, or if they actually felt really quite differently, and then you could discuss what should happen next time if they disagree. That instead of going into the client meeting, let's agree we have another chance to explore what we really agree on and what we don't agree on before we go forward to present something to a client. So number 3, right, you want to have your intentions very clear. I think it's actually quite helpful to say that to somebody. I care about you. And I see something that you're doing that I think is going to harm you. I think maybe it'll be okay now, but if you move into another role, I think this is going to be a problem. And I'd like to try to help you address it now, right? So show people your intentions, make it clear to them, And again, be honest with yourself about what those are. Think through your own internal hesitation. You can even verbalize that too. I was kind of worried about bringing this up. I wasn't sure how you would react, but I want you to know it's coming from a place where I'm really trying to help. If you can verbalize those kinds of things, again, it should work to help put somebody more at ease. And again, part of this is if someone's never heard from you in this kind of approach, at the first time it might be difficult for them to really receive your feedback. But if you can start to get into a habit of a process and to, in fact, seek feedback yourself and show that that's kind of the way you work, you can get sort of a positive reinforcing cycle to start happening. So one of the big challenges is that people get defensive, and I'm guilty of it myself, getting certain kinds of feedback from my spouse or from whomever. So again, we go back to just doing your best to show positive intent, being very thoughtful about listening to them. Don't cut them off if they try to say, even if they're being defensive, don't shut them down. Show them that you're really trying to hear and you're trying to understand their perspective and their viewpoint. But bring it back to the actions, and if they're talking about, I don't feel like you understand me. I don't think you're listening. I don't think you really know what I'm doing every day. Try to say, okay, let's come back to my point. This happened in the meeting. I'd like to talk about this, right? So try to pull it back to that narrow focus thing again, and that should, again, help. It may not, and the more data you have, the more likely you can sort of break down the defensiveness. But there may be that moment again where you have to say, this isn't working right now. I'd like to come back to this. Maybe we can set up another appointment to talk about this tomorrow. That might be one possibility. I think you should think about this, and we could have a conversation in class to say, have you found any other effective techniques when you just feel like somebody's being defensive, to turning that around or kind of coming back and still getting that feedback delivered effective. So that part of the process of sort of checking or inquiring is kind of about this idea of checking for responsibility. Feedback is not going to be effective if we don't get to the point where people own it. And you can't collaborate, right? You can't coach to figure out how to improve if they don't take a certain amount of responsibility. But if you can even get them to say, what if if you hear this, that should be H-A-R. If you hear them say, well, what if something, right? Like maybe if they're starting to redirect it and not fully own it, but kind of act like, what if so-and-so could do something? Couldn't somebody else, blah, 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 right? That would indicate to you that they're starting to hear you and there's maybe the chance for a foot in the door. So I think to sort of gently continue along that kind of sort of order of reasoning might pull you into a place where you get some acknowledgement. Or maybe you can at least get them to say, all right, right now it seems like we can't agree that you caused this problem or you are the source of this problem. Can we agree that this outcome was less than ideal, right? And maybe can we think about how do we change things so that we get a better outcome in the future? Now you're at least in some kind of a dialogue with them that might help you move in the direction of them accepting. They may be at a moment where they're too proud or too defensive to admit it now, but they will have heard you and they maybe can go forward in making the change. So I want to talk about that more. You can kind of probe on that. Or, if they're still sort of feeling like they're too defensive or not quite ready there, this is where you could say, I think this deserves some more conversation, because it sounds like a more complex problem than maybe I understood. So could we talk about it and make a meeting? So that's another way to kind of redirect and at least have the foot in the door that you're not shut down with defensiveness and there's a window to go through to continue the conversation and try to get the behavioral change you're looking for. So, the final building blocks here, like in terms of trying to get a sense of what's happened, is once we've delivered the feedback and we've worked to see at least that maybe defenses have been lowered and it's been heard, we try to look for this in terms of inquiry. So, ask them, do you understand what I've said? Do you want to give me your perspective? Do you want to give me some response to how you're thinking about what happened. Are we able to talk a little bit about like why this happened, so that we can think about what to do in the future so it doesn't happen again, right? So those are some of the kinds of terms to talk about for inquiry. There's a lot of good reasons to do this. Number one, it gets you in listening mode, so the person feels like they're able to air what their concerns are. By letting them sort of mirror things back to you, you can see if they've actually heard you and understood what you were trying to convey. Maybe they'll start talking about why things have been going on that help you problem solve. And then, of course, whether they're really open to trying yet, or whether you've kind of gotten through are other reasons that inquiry will help. And then finally, I already mentioned this a little bit in first presenting the process, that the final stages are kind of a collaborative approach. So there may be circumstances where someone is very young or very new, and if we think about it in terms of motivation theory, they don't feel like they have the ability or the connection to put effort to get outcome, and they really do need some more specific guidance about how to do their work. But aside from those situations, you're better off trying to do some kind of mutual problem solving and help them, right? Not tell them how to fix it, but help them come to the conclusion, because people will be more motivated to continue that behavior if they had that sort of autonomy over choosing how they're going to address this problem. So, in terms of coaching, I think predominantly when I think about psychological support, just listening, reassuring, helping them understand you do care about them and you like them to be successful. And then instrumental guidance, if they really do want some help, some specific kinds of coaching, feedback, ideas to go and complete the work, then you might get engaged in, you could try this, or you could try that. Or what if I set you up with this kind of support system? Getting more into solutions, but kind of wait for them to ask for some of that help before you just start sort of dumping that on them. And then finally, I think the other thing is to think carefully as you're planning your feedback about the right conditions. You want to do this in a place that's quiet and private. I think it's important to be respectful of people's dignity. That's that interpersonal justice, so people don't feel called out or embarrassed or lose face in the process. We don't want interruptions or disruptions, because it's already going to be hard enough for people to kind of process and internalize what you're saying if there's some kind of other activities or interruptions happening. Timing, we want to get this as close to the behavior as possible. That's why those annual performance reviews are frustrating to a lot of people. It's never fun to find out that 7 months ago you were doing something that people didn't really appreciate, and you were allowed to kind of go on with that for quite a long time before any corrective feedback was provided. You need to have your own emotions in check and be calm and in the right state of mind. So, it is absolutely not the right time to give feedback when you're frustrated or heated or angry or in conflict, because you will not control your own emotions and you're unlikely to have an effective outcome happening. Likewise, the person's state of mind, right? You want to make sure that they're not, under a time pressure, they're not rushing to leave the office. You don't want to do something where they're not prepared to do this. So there's a delicate balance between timing and keeping things close, and not doing something where there's a lot of emotion involved, or when it's not a distraction-free moment. But those are all things to consider. And again, when we come back to class, we can talk a little bit about some effective methods that some of you have tried.